They were never supposed to wear the uniform. In the summer of 1941, Major General Thomas Holcomb, Commandant of the Marine Corps, made his position crystal clear when he declared he would rather have 5,000 whites than 250,000 Negroes in his beloved Corps. The Marine Corps, unlike the Army and Navy, had successfully resisted integration since the American Revolution for nearly 167 years. No black American had earned the title Marine. It was a point of institutional pride, an unspoken tradition enforced through policy and prejudice. But war changes everything. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802 in June 1941, prohibiting racial discrimination in the defense industry and federal government, the Marine Corps had no choice but to reluctantly open its ranks. The first black recruits arrived at Montford Point Camp, a segregated training facility adjacent to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, in August 1942. They stepped off buses into a world of swamps, snakes, and systemic racism. They were not welcome. While white recruits trained at established bases with proper facilities, black recruits found themselves in hastily constructed wooden barracks amid mosquito-infested swamps. Their training was designed to break them, not build them. White officers viewed assignment to Montford Point as punishment and took their frustrations out on the black recruits. The message was clear: you don't belong here. Many of the white officers looked upon being assigned there as punishment, and they took it out on the guys, recalled Jack McDowell, who trained at Montford Point in 1945. The drill instructors seemed determined to prove black men couldn't measure up to the Marine Corps' exacting standards. But something unexpected happened. The more they were pushed, the stronger they became. Under the watchful eyes of legendary drill instructors like Gilbert Hoshmark Johnson and Edgar Huffa, among the first black non-commissioned officers, these men transformed. Johnson, who earned his nickname from the 3 service stripes on his sleeve indicating prior Army and Navy service, had a simple philosophy: I'm an ogre, but fair. Huff was even more direct, telling recruits, you've got to be better than any Marine in New River, and they became exactly that. The men of Montford Point understood what most white Americans didn't, that they were fighting 2 wars simultaneously, one against fascism abroad and another against racism at home. Every drill, every march, every inspection had to be perfect. There was no room for error, no allowance for mediocrity. They knew that the slightest mistake would be magnified through the lens of prejudice and used as evidence that black men weren't fit to be Marines. By early 1943, a transformation was underway. The first black drill instructors emerged, men like Johnson and Huff, who understood the dual battle being fought. Under their guidance, the men of Montford Point developed a fierce pride and unshakable discipline. They endured humiliations both large and small, being transported to the rifle range on a rusty barge rather than buses provided for white recruits, being called boy by officers many years their junior, being refused service in the town of Jacksonville just outside the base. As one recruit put it, we took everything they threw at us and asked for more. We knew we had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. By 1943, as the Pacific War intensified, over 20,000 black Americans would train at Montford Point. But even as they mastered the art of being Marines, the Corps had no intention of putting them in combat. Instead, they were assigned to ammunition and depot companies' service support roles where they would load supplies, handle ammunition, and stay far from the front lines. The Marine Corps didn't believe black men could fight. The Japanese would soon prove them wrong. The first Montford Point Marines deployed overseas in 1943, primarily to support roles in the Pacific Theater. They served at Saipan, Guam, Palau, and Iwo Jima, bloody battles where they caught glimpses of combat's ferocity, but largely remained in supporting roles. Japanese propaganda specifically targeted these black Marines, distributing leaflets that portrayed them as cowards who would run at the first sign of battle. Tokyo Rose, the infamous Japanese propagandist, dedicated entire broadcasts to undermining black morale, suggesting they were fighting for a country that didn't even consider them full citizens. The propaganda backfired spectacularly. Instead of demoralizing the black Marines, it steeled their resolve. They had something to prove, not just to the Japanese, but to their fellow Americans and to themselves. The true test would come on Okinawa. The morning of April 1st, 1945, dawned with an eerie calm over the shores of Okinawa. Easter Sunday. Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious landing in the Pacific Theater, was underway. Among the massive invasion force were nearly 2,000 black Marines, the largest concentration of African-American Marines deployed in any Pacific operation. Most belonged to ammunition and depot companies of the 8th Field Depot, supporting the 1st, 2nd, and 6th Marine Divisions. As the landing craft approached the beaches, the men braced themselves. They had heard stories from Iwo Jima, where the landing beaches had turned into slaughterhouses under withering Japanese fire. Many said silent prayers as the ramps lowered. They expected hell. Instead, they found an almost vacant shoreline. The strange silence on the beach only heightened their anxiety. Where was the enemy? Where was the hellfire that had greeted Marines at Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima? The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Matsuru Oshijima, had abandoned the traditional beach defense strategy. Instead, he'd withdrawn his 100,000 troops into the island's rugged interior, where they'd prepared an intricate network of caves, tunnels, and concrete bunkers. It was a strategy designed to maximize American casualties and break the will of the invading force. The initial landing went unopposed, a tactical surprise that would soon give way to some of the most brutal fighting of the Pacific War. Private James Anderson of the 36th Marine Depot Company remembered the surreal calm as they landed. It felt wrong, like walking into a trap, he later recalled. We'd been told the Japanese considered us inferior fighters, but we were determined to prove them wrong. We might have been segregated, but we were still Marines. The beaches were quickly secured, and the combat Marines pushed inland toward the island's mountainous spine. The Black Marines of the ammunition and depot companies moved to establish supply dumps on the beachhead. Their orders were simple: unload ships, stack supplies, distribute ammunition, and stay out of combat. But on Okinawa, as one veteran put it, there was no rear area. The entire island was a battlefield. For the first 2 days, the American advance proceeded with surprising ease. The men of the 36th and 8th Marine Companies worked around the clock to move supplies from the ships to the shore. Tons of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel were stockpiled to support the combat divisions pushing inland. The work was exhausting but relatively safe. Then, on the third day, everything changed. The true nature of Oshijima's strategy became clear. The Japanese unleashed a coordinated counterattack across the island, including infiltration units that slipped behind American lines to target supply areas. Simultaneously, waves of kamikaze aircraft, the dreaded Divine Wind, targeted the Allied fleet offshore. Private First Class Robert McFadder and his comrades in the 8th Marine Ammunition Company were organizing an ammunition dump when the attack came. Japanese mortar rounds whistled through the air, exploding among the carefully stacked artillery shells and rifle ammunition. The secondary explosions ripped through the dump, sending deadly shrapnel in all directions. Death came from anywhere to anywhere, McFadder later recalled. There was no shelter, no defilade, and no concealment. What happened next would change the narrative forever. These men, who had been told they weren't fit for combat, who had been trained primarily for service duties, grabbed their rifles. They didn't retreat. They didn't panic. Oh, they fought. Sergeant William Jenkins, originally a chaplain's assistant, found himself manning a .30 caliber machine gun as Japanese soldiers attempted to overrun the position. Private Leo Mon, another Black Marine, dove into a foxhole when Japanese mortar rounds began landing around him. His only thought was to pray not just for his safety, but, remarkably, to forgive the Japanese for their actions, even as he prepared to defend himself. The firefight lasted through the night. By dawn, the ammunition dump was secured, but at a cost. 5 Black Marines lay dead. 12 more were wounded, but they had held the line. The supplies that would fuel the American advance remained intact because men who were never supposed to see combat had fought like seasoned warriors. The pattern would repeat itself throughout the campaign. As the battle for Okinawa intensified, the carefully drawn lines between combat and support units blurred beyond recognition. Black Marines found themselves performing tasks far beyond their training or assignment. They became stretcher bearers, retrieving wounded white Marines from the front lines under intense enemy fire. They operated as impromptu infantry, setting up defensive perimeters around vital supply areas. They drove trucks filled with ammunition and supplies to the front, navigating roads exposed to enemy artillery and sniper fire. Lieutenant Lawrence Diggs, one of the few black officers, remembered, "We were told to stay in our lane, to stick to supply duties. But when shells start falling and men start dying, there are no lanes anymore. There's just the mission, and Marines who need to accomplish it." The geography of Okinawa made the battle particularly grueling. The island was only about 60 miles long and between 2 and 18 miles wide, but its terrain was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. The southern part of the island, where the Japanese had established their main defensive line, was a landscape of steep ridges, deep ravines, and heavily fortified caves. Every hill had to be taken individually, often at a terrible cost in American lives. For the Black Marines, this meant constantly pushing supplies closer to an ever-changing front line. Supply dumps had to be established, defended, and sometimes abandoned as the battle lines shifted. The work never stopped, not even during the torrential rains that plagued the campaign, turning roads into mud rivers and foxholes into miniature ponds. By late April, the Japanese resistance had stiffened considerably. The American advance slowed to a bloody crawl. Combat Marines found themselves locked in a brutal war of attrition, fighting for individual hills with names like Sugar Loaf, Half Moon, and Conical. Each yard of ground was paid for in blood. The 36th Marine Depot Company became legendary for their actions on May 15, 1945. As Japanese forces launched a massive counterattack against the American lines, the front began to buckle. Combat units called desperately for ammunition. Without it, positions would be overrun, and the advance that had cost so many lives would be lost. Captain James Ferguson, the white commanding officer of the 36th, gathered his men. "I need volunteers," he said simply. "The line units need ammunition, and they need it now." Every man stepped forward. What followed was a display of courage that defied every stereotype. The men of the 36th formed a human chain across a half-mile stretch of exposed terrain swept by Japanese artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire. For hours, they passed ammunition hand-to-hand to the front-line units. When one man fell, another took his place. They worked through the night, their faces illuminated only by the flash of explosions and the burning vehicles that dotted the landscape. By morning, over a dozen were wounded, but the line held. The Japanese attack faltered and broke against a wall of American firepower delivered by black hands that weren't supposed to be capable of such courage. Private First Class Howard Porter remembered the night vividly. The noise was deafening. Shells exploding, men shouting, the crack of rifles. We could see the tracers flying overhead like deadly fireflies. But nobody broke the chain. Nobody ran. We were Marines, and Marines don't leave other Marines hanging. News of their actions reached all the way to Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters. The commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, Pedro del Valle, visited the 36th personally to express his gratitude. "Without your ammunition, we would have lost that position," he told them. "You men are Marines in every sense of the word." Yet even as they proved themselves in battle, the sting of segregation remained. Black Marines wounded in action were treated in separate medical facilities. They ate at separate mess halls. They slept in separate tents. The brotherhood of combat did not extend to the social structure of the Corps. The battle for Okinawa ground on, becoming a savage war of attrition. It reigned for 42 of the 82 days of combat, turning the battlefield into a quagmire of mud, blood, and spent shell casings. The fighting was so intense that combat Marines began to break under the strain. Battle fatigue, what we now recognize as PTS, claimed victims at an alarming rate. Yet the Black Marines of the ammunition and depot companies maintained a remarkable resilience. Perhaps it was because they'd already been hardened by a lifetime of fighting a different kind of battle back home. Perhaps it was because they carried an additional burden. They weren't just fighting for their country or their lives. They were fighting to prove their worth as men, as Americans, as Marines. Private James Whitfield of the 18th Marine Depot Company put it plainly, "We knew what they said about us, what they thought about us. Every day we stayed and fought was a day we proved them wrong." The Japanese, for their part, had begun to take notice of these Black Marines. Intelligence reports captured later revealed that Japanese officers had been confused by the presence of black troops in Marine uniforms. According to their propaganda and racial theories, these men should have broken and fled at the first sign of combat. Instead, they were displaying the same tenacity and fighting spirit as their white counterparts. A Japanese officer's diary, recovered after the battle, contained this telling entry: "The Black Americans fight with unexpected ferocity. They do not surrender even when wounded." Are they truly the same people described in our intelligence briefings? By June 1945, as the battle for Okinawa reached its climax, the Black Marines had become an essential part of the American war machine. Japanese were being slowly, methodically crushed between the advancing American forces and the sea at their backs. Ushijima's elaborate defensive network was being dismantled bunker by bunker, cave by cave. When General Ushijima realized his situation was hopeless, he launched one final, desperate counterattack aimed at the American supply lines directly at positions held by Black Marine units. In the early hours of June 19th, over 400 Japanese soldiers infiltrated American lines and struck the supply dumps at Kunishi Ridge. The 36th and 8th Marine companies found themselves fighting for their lives in hand-to-hand combat. Sergeant William Carter, who before the war had been a schoolteacher in Alabama, found himself leading a makeshift squad of ammunition handlers against a Japanese assault team. Armed with nothing more than rifles and grenades, they held their position for 3 hours until reinforcements arrived. It was like something out of a nightmare, Carter would later recall. They came at us screaming, waving swords and bayonets. We had ammunition stockpiles to protect, and we knew if they reached those, they could blow half the ridge to Kingdom Come. The fighting was desperate, often hand-to-hand. Marines who had been trained to stack shells now used those same shells as crude clubs when ammunition ran out. Men who had been taught to drive trucks now fought with bayonets and entrenching tools. It was savage, primordial combat, stripped of all pretense and formality. When the fighting ended, 75 Japanese lay dead around their position. Carter had been wounded twice but refused evacuation. "I didn't come this far to leave my men," he told the corpsman who tried to evacuate him. The Marines who weren't supposed to be fighters had just repelled what would be one of the last organized Japanese attacks of the campaign. 3 days later, on June 22, 1945, Lieutenant General Ushijima and his chief of staff committed ritual suicide rather than surrender. With their deaths, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa came to an end. The Battle of Okinawa was officially over. It had been the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War, over 12,000 American dead, nearly 50,000 wounded. The Japanese had lost over 100,000 soldiers, and another 100,000 Okinawan civilians had perished in the crossfire. The island, once a tropical paradise, had been transformed into a scarred wasteland of blasted coral and splintered trees. For the Black Marines, the victory was bittersweet. They had proven themselves beyond any doubt, performing with distinction under the most challenging conditions imaginable. 9 Black Marines had been killed in action during the war, with 78 wounded men who, according to the original Marine Corps plan, weren't even supposed to face enemy fire. Lieutenant General Alexander Vandergrift, the Marine Corps commandant who had succeeded Holcomb, visited Okinawa in the war's aftermath. After witnessing the contributions of the Black Marines, he made a statement that would echo through Marine Corps history. "The Negro Marines are no longer on trial. They are Marines, period." Yet when they returned home, they found a nation still deeply divided by race. The America they had fought for remained a land of segregated schools, segregated neighborhoods, and segregated dreams. Many returned to communities where they couldn't vote, couldn't use public facilities, and couldn't find employment worthy of their sacrifices. The same country they had defended still treated them as second-class citizens. Edgar Cole, a Montford Point Marine who had served on Okinawa, experienced this contradiction firsthand. Traveling home on leave, he was stopped by a police officer who slapped his official orders out of his hand and told him that he wasn't allowed to stand on a street corner waiting for his ride despite wearing the uniform of a United States Marine. In Cleveland, Ohio, Private R.J. Wood was actually arrested for impersonating a Marine because the police officers simply refused to believe that Black Marines existed. Sergeant John Brooks returned to his hometown in Mississippi to find that the local bus driver refused to accept his military ID as valid identification. When Brooks protested, he was thrown off the bus. "I had just spent 2 years fighting for freedom," Brooks later said, "only to come home and find out that freedom didn't include me." The final irony came when President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, officially desegregating the armed forces. The Marine Corps, which had resisted integration the longest, was the last service to fully comply. Montford Point Camp was finally decommissioned on September 9, 1949, ending 7 years of segregated Marine training. The Black Marines who had stormed the beaches of Okinawa, who had fought with distinction across the Pacific, had changed the Corps forever, not through protest or politics, but through their blood, sweat, and indomitable spirit. They had taken everything their country and their Corps could throw at them and emerged victorious not just over the Japanese but over the pernicious myth of racial inferiority. Their legacy would live on in the generations of Black Marines who followed them, men like Frank E. Peterson Jr., who became the first Black Marine Corps aviator in 1952 and would eventually rise to the rank of lieutenant general, men like Ronald L. Green, who would become the 18th Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps in 2015. Yet for decades their story remained largely untold, overshadowed by the more well-known narratives of the Tuskegee Airmen and the Buffalo Soldiers. The Montford Point Marines fought not just on the battlefields of the Pacific but against the tide of historical amnesia that threatened to erase their contributions entirely. "We weren't looking for recognition," said Staff Sergeant Joseph Carpenter, who served on Okinawa. "We were just doing our duty as Marines. But it does hurt when your sacrifices are forgotten, when your place in history is erased." That erasure began to be corrected in 2012, nearly 7 decades after their service, when the Montford Point Marines were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. Of the 20,000 who trained at Montford Point, fewer than 400 were still alive to receive this long-overdue recognition. At the ceremony in Washington, D.C., then Commandant of the Marine Corps, General James F. Amos spoke words that were both an acknowledgement and an apology. To the Montford Point Marines, thank you for paving the way. Thank you for standing the watch. And thank you for not only opening the door for African Americans, but for kicking it down. Sergeant Major Gilbert Hashmark Johnson, the fearsome drill instructor who had helped forge the first generation of Black Marines, did not live to see this honor. But Camp Johnson, formerly Montford Point, now bears his name. The only Marine Corps installation named after an African American. It stands as a testament to a battle fought on two fronts, against a foreign enemy abroad and against prejudice at home. The legacy of the Montford Point Marines extends far beyond military history. Their struggle and triumph are woven into the broader tapestry of the civil rights movement, a powerful reminder that progress often comes at a terrible cost. Long before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, before Martin Luther King Jr. shared his dream, these men were quietly dismantling barriers through their excellence and courage. As America continues to wrestle with questions of racial equality and justice, the story of the Montford Point Marines offers a sobering reminder of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. They represent the best of what America can be, a nation where courage and character matter more than color, where sacrifice and service are honored regardless of race. For the dwindling number of Montford Point veterans still alive today, the recognition has been welcome, if long overdue. Many have expressed the hope that their story will inspire future generations to overcome whatever obstacles they face with the same quiet dignity and unwavering determination. "We didn't change the Marine Corps because we marched or protested," said Private First Class Joseph Clemens, who served with the 36th Marine Depot Company on Okinawa. "We changed it by being Marines in every sense of the word, by doing our duty with honor, courage, and commitment." The story of the Black Marines who fought at Okinawa is more than just a chapter in military history. It is a powerful reminder that courage knows no color, that valor is not determined by race, and that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not just against a foreign enemy, but against the prejudices of one's own countrymen. They were told they were weak. They proved they were Marines. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps us keep these untold stories alive. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of Black heroes whose courage changed the course of history.